thank you very much for inviting me to speak today about the work of my great-grandmother, Lady Muriel Paget, who was my mother's mother's mother, and to speak about her work and her mission of mercy in the newly formed Republic of Czechoslovakia in 1919. So I'm currently writing a book about her life. So it's wonderful to be able to share this fascinating and relatively forgotten story in the shared history of our two nations. So this is a first for me to take part in such an event, and I'm doing it, like probably most people listening, in unusual circumstances. So I find myself in solitary confinement in Spain, far from my home, my husband, my children, my family, and my papers. But I felt it was really important to remember this work, and also this lockdown period has given me a lot of time to think about her personal response to crisis, and which I feel is relevant to today. I want to firstly state that the British effort in Czechoslovakia was much less substantial than the American. But what distinguishes it was that this entire effort, this entire work, was the result of a single woman entirely. So to me, that is very significant when we think about the times, we think about she hardly had the vote, and it adds extra meaning when we imagine what she had to overcome in order to achieve her aims. She was also a young wife and a mother. Her youngest child was only 4. Her eldest was 17. So we too remember today their personal sacrifice. So we're going to now move into a sort of whistle-stop tour of the story, the context of where Thomas Masaryk and Lady Muriel Paget met, which was against the very dramatic and turbulent background of the tragic conflict, which is called, we all know, as the First World War. Events that were changing the face of the planet were happening, and they were right at the very centre of the hub of this. So Thomas Masaryk was there in command of the Czech Legion, trying to assemble the Czech forces at that time, because the disarray that was happening after the October Revolution that had happened in that autumn of 1917. And Muriel Paget was there at the head of the Anglo-Russian hospital that she had founded in 1915 with the Red Cross to nurse the Russian soldiers. So when they actually, the situation was becoming more traumatic, and she was in Odessa. She'd gone down from Petersburg, from Petrograd, down to Odessa, where she was working with her field units on the Eastern Front. When the, Okay. So she was there in Odessa when things got chaotic and she had to leave and go back to go to Kiev. And this is where Thomas Masaryk and her met. So what I wanted to just emphasize in this before we move forward was the power of friendship in this story, because Lady Muriel had a huge capacity for friendship, and obviously enduring friendships are formed in these very dramatic circumstances. And that was the case between these two great characters, Thomas Masaryk, Lady Muriel. And the power of friendship between people became the power of friendship between nations, and that was very important. So the image we see here is of the Anglo-Russian hospital, which in St. Petersburg, which was the symbol, the powerful symbol of the friendship between Britain and Russia. So the situation was getting much more dramatic. The chaos of civil war was sweeping the country. They were in Kiev, where the siege, terrible siege of Kiev took place. This was, sorry, I should have told you, we're sort of January 1918 by now. By the time they got to Kiev, it was probably towards the end of January. And in February, then began the siege of Kiev, which lasted for 10 days, which was an extremely traumatic and terrible event in which Lady Muriel actually got decorated for her bravery. They both were in were faced with great personal danger, and also they witnessed very, very shocking atrocities, the memories of which Lady Muriel never forgot. So the key problem now was how they were going to get away from the situation that was becoming increasingly unsafe. And it was thanks to the timely intervention of the great British consul, Picton Bagg, who was another hero in the story, who basically took Thomas Masrick in as part of the British contingent. He issued him with a British passport. He then travelled. He was going to then travel as incognito under the pseudonym of Thomas Marsden as a representative of the Times, the Times correspondent. That was his fake cover, as it were. And then, sorry. So that was it. This is the beginning of a huge journey which started in Kiev, in which for the first part of the journey, Thomas Masrick was he was sleeping on a utensil rack in the kitchen compartment on this carriage, while Muriel Paget was in a separate padded cell, unpadded by that point. And this very dramatic journey under the protection of 5 Red Guards, they leapt out of Kiev, and they went up to Moscow, and the whole way across the Russian steppes to Vladivostok, where they arrived in April. But 6 or 7 weeks later, from there they went to Japan and on to. But the thing I wanted to mention is that on that journey, Thomas Masrick, this distinguished professor, wrote his work, the seminal work, which was very important, was called The New Europe. So that was written on this journey. So they go from Canada and enter America. First stop was Chicago, which was where Masrick was greeted by huge crowds. And then they were given an audience with President Wilson at the White House together. So they were actually in that audience together, and it was a very important meeting because it was the point at which they were the President of America was listening to this and going to put his support behind the creation of the new republic. It was also the moment when Muriel met Alice Masrick, the doctor Alice Masrick, and this sort of Red Cross sisterhood was formed. And there were other important women there at the time. So it was a very interesting period as well for a meeting of female minds. So now there is a pause because this next stage takes place the following year, 1919. Okay, so we are into the post-World War I setting. The lights have gone out all over Europe, and Muriel Paget receives this letter from Dr. Alice Masrick. Come and help us. We are at the edge of a precipice. Our children die. The conditions are desperate, but we won't die, for we are destined to live, and we have a word to say in the world's history. They're very moving, these words, and they were addressed to the right person. This appeal went straight to Muriel's heart, and she then got into action. This is what she was really a supreme organizer. So rapid response. She went to gather data about the crisis. She assembled, she organized a meeting at the House of Commons. She formed a high-powered committee with important and influential people. She spoke to the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and got London really moving. She made the case that it was as a result of the 4-year Allied blockade that she was, the country was in such dire need. So they then founded the Anglo-Czech Relief Fund, and she launched a fundraising appeal in the UK national press, which was not universally received well because there was some opposition. I mean, Lord Northcliffe, for example, who was the very influential pressman who owned the Times, the Daily Mail and other papers, he wrote saying, very disapproving, that she was supporting other people when there are so many people in our country who need relief. What about our own starving youngsters? That was the sort of tone. Anyway, she pressed on and headed straight off to Paris to the peace conference that was taking place there in the Palace of Versailles. And this is another extremely important moment, because the Lady Muriel was one of the very, very few women, probably you could count them on a single hand, who actually got access into these corridors of power. So she got in there, she started to lobby for the cause. She wanted to talk about the plight of the war's silent victims, women and children. She always thought about them. She'd seen how they suffered in Russia. And but she was faced with a certain amount of opposition, again, in forms of chauvinism, resistance. But she had huge charm, huge energy, and she managed to persuade Hoover. He became a great friend and ally, and he immediately gave her a trainload of fats that came from Rotterdam, and also gave his the support of America for her ongoing work. So this was very important because it was the beginning of a new start to a humanitarian aid response, which really she single-handedly pioneered. This is a reference which I pull out because it really does show what she had to face. How lucky Lady Muriel isn't in the plural. There was also Edward Beneš, the Czechoslovakian foreign minister, who was protesting, protégez-moi de cette dame, protect me from this woman, which I've never understood, because I thought he should have been asking for lots more of her. Anyway, so then from there, she went from Paris to Prague, missing her first train originally because her visa had run out. So she wasn't there to be greeted by the guard of honor that had been put on for her. But still, she arrived a couple of days later, and she started the fact-finding tour of the country with Alice Masaryk, which was an extremely important part of this journey, because in that tour, she was assessing the situation in the country. She was able to give an extremely comprehensive report of all that was going on, the figures, etc. And that was actually going to change minds back in London, which was going to be important. She also was able to talk about the terrible danger in the new country. There was a state she called neither peace nor war. There were border wars. There was things rumbling on after the First World War, and there was also, as Mark spoke about, the threat of Bolshevism. So she tried to, having assessed the situation, she tried to promote a $10 million loan idea with the British government to be supported by Lloyds Bank, but that was never, that I can find, was never actually given. So, but what she did manage to secure was the support of the British military. And so the army gave her a team of about 100 soldiers to help oversee the distribution of aid. And so with that, she also inaugurated her own new uniformed professionals. She had to go back to London to recruit. And she actually designed the uniform for this new team of her Paget mission. And she'd also used liberally the photographs that she'd taken while she was touring to show, really to raise awareness of the plight and the situation. So she did not hesitate to use these very sometimes very distressing images of what she saw. And this was a little card that was designed also to show them the children barefoot in the snow. So the third part of this is really the Paget mission, her humanitarian disaster relief program. This is important, the mission statement, because it tells us really what she was about. The aim of the Lady Muriel Paget mission and the League of Red Cross is to establish in all its branches a permanent system of social welfare, which can be carried on in perfect sequence when the missions leave. This was always her desire. That whatever she did, she would come in to help for an emergency, and then make sure that by working from the ground upwards, that everything would work perfectly when they left. So the conditions in Czechoslovakia were very, very severe. There was disease, malnutrition, famine, poverty, unemployment, very, very high rates of infant mortality. And as a result also of the desperate loss of infrastructure, which Mark has also described very well, and communications and transport, it was very difficult to reach a lot of these areas. So there was a dire need for all these basic supplies, but there was also a very severe shortage of actual medical personnel to do the work. and staff to help with the distribution. I mean, there's a terrible figure that she had in her report. So there were 32 doctors for 3.5 million people in Slovakia at the time she arrived. One nurse in a 300-mile radius. So really very, very chronic for them. So this was what their welfare program was there for. What we are trying to prevent, we see this little child here who's suffering from rickets caused by malnutrition. Her very first first phase of work was to organise a mass vaccination program across the nation. So that was for typhus, typhoid, smallpox, etc. So for that, she had a mobile medical unit that travelled with doctors and nurses, and that was able to therefore access very, very remote areas. So that was part of it. And then there was the feeding scheme, which was extremely key, opening up of food banks, soup kitchens in schools, and then you had travelling food kitchens, soup kitchens as well, as we've already seen. There was some resistance from the children to the English habit of eating porridge for breakfast, which they definitely did not like. And then the other thing that she was doing as part of this was opening and equipping hospitals. So there were orphanages and always this emphasis on mothers and children. And she was very, very clever at encouraging other people to take part, people who had big houses and who had means at their disposal. So, for example, there was one house which was owned by someone called Baron de Forest, who owned a big castle at Rosice, so he gave it over to the Paget mission. And then there was a famous violinist, Kubelik, whose home was once a royal residence and had the useful addition of a grand piano in every room, but not quite so much running water. But so they also, that was a children's home they opened near Zelina in Bitkitra. I'm sorry, my pronunciation's terrible. Anyway, so that was another important aspect. And in this photograph, we see her, I think that might be her, I don't know, wearing the cap there, but we see the sort of motion of these children and all of them gathering round for the food and help. So she was also instigating various health and hygiene programs, trying to educate. And then there was the other very key bit, which was the distribution of clothing to the needy. So there was no thread when she first arrived there. So they couldn't actually make clothes from even if they would wanted to. So the first delivery they got was of a lot of balaclavas, and so the children were using these as a combined sort of hat and jersey. And there was also a sort of shortage of boys' underwear, which meant that there was a surfeit of these frilly knickers, which they added on top with a sweater. And there was a certain amount of fun about this funny English costume. Sorry, this funny English custom, excuse me. And also, of course, she was always attentive to the needs of the injured veterans and would install aim to retrain and build them up. So the crisis management, so really using her exceptional powers of organisation, she would first of all making sure that the supply lines were in operation. This photograph, actually, this picture is one of my grandmother's. It shows a map of the travelling clinic, which Mark very brilliantly managed to find and make the exact context, so we do know where those villages were. So that was one of the itineraries of their mission. So again, this was all about collaborating between all the different levels and bringing things to the needy, the people who needed it most. And always this work was done in the spirit of great humanity and kindness and respect and compassion. That's what really distinguished her work. In this picture, we see there's a food kitchen there for the men, for the soldiers, who also behind we see the Red Cross there. And we can see the way that what Muriel Paget was also excellent in was liaising the efforts of different nations of different. So there was the international effort. There was the funds coming from the Supreme Economic Council, which was being distributed. There was also the Red Cross, the Save the Children Fund, which arrived in the summer of 1919. And there's the ARA, and also the Paget and the Czech Red Heart Society, which were existing charities that were working on the ground. And the smooth running between all these operations was really her forte. So now this one, we get to the challenges for the mission workforce, which were huge. And when they arrived, these women who'd come from England mostly, and Scotland, the United Kingdom, but mostly, so there was the language barrier. In fact, there were several languages spoken in the area, so there was that. There was only one linguist really amongst them who mastered it. They had to overcome the distrust because there was naturally a lot of suspicion of what these people were doing and why they were doing it. And then there was a huge amount of physical hardship, these very arduous journeys on the bad communications we talked about. So they had to endure a lot of physical hardship, and they also had to go to places which were far, far away in the snow, on carts and ponies, and in incredible situations. Some of the stories are wonderful, but they also witnessed a lot of extreme suffering, and as a result, there was a lot of wear and tear on their health, psychological wear and tear. Has to be said that the mission workers who spoke later, towards the end of their lives, about this work, however, did describe it as being one of the happiest times in their life. So that might tell us that perhaps helping, however difficult it is, but helping others is rather wonderful. And then, but the sad thing, which is where we see in this picture, is the tombstone of Sister Margaret McCullum, who was a Scottish nurse who had worked with Muriel in Russia, and who contracted typhus while she was nursing patients suffering from that disease in South Africa. And this is a wonderful tribute. It's somewhere I would like to visit and lay flowers myself at some point. I wanted to go last year for the 100th anniversary, which would have been at the end of September 2019, but another day. So really, to resume now, a summary of Paget mission accomplishments. It's very difficult we don't have a comprehensive list of the figures and the statistics, which Mark had so marvelously organised about the American effort. It's very disorganised, the records. We know, for example, in certain parts of Slovakia, there was a 2 million attendance at the various feeding stations. There was, at the peak, these 24,000 meals a day being served, and many, many attendances at the clinics. But the lasting legacy really is what this heart-centered work that she initiated, which is, and the best tribute, which is where I'm going to end, is on this homage, which came from the chairman of the Slovakian Red Cross in 1969, so 31 years after Muriel died. So she never actually personally received this homage, but I'm just going to read it because I find it very moving. Good people, thanks to you, you came to our country, to an unknown country, among unknown people, without any fanfares and without any showiness, just into the middle of poverty and suffering, backwardness and hard social and health conditions. You came like the sun is coming after a dark, restless and cloudy night. You came to help us to treat the open wounds from which we were bleeding after the end of the First World War. You came to our country with an endless love and with a heart full of unusual self-sacrifice and love to a neighbour in order to help the most affected and suffering people. You came to our country as a man comes to another man, spreading the humane ideas under the flag of the Red Cross. You came and we called you just simply the Miss Paget's mission of Red Cross. So I'm just going to finish really to just say how wonderful it is to be following the life of my great-grandmother. She was well known in her lifetime as the Second Lady of the Lamp, and was a beautiful and reforming spirit and had a very important part to play. Continued from this work, she went on to do relief programs in the Crimea, aided in Poland, in Romania. She had relief missions in the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and also in Russia. But she worked hugely hard, and that was a massive sacrifice. So the last, some days during the years while she's in Czechoslovakia, she would be sleeping in carriages and trains going between centres, exhausted by the end of it. And by 1924, she had been diagnosed with cancer, which was the disease that was going which she fought for the next 14 years, very, very bravely. But so it was a wonderful sacrifice, but she loved what she did. Thank you. Really would love to have to hear from anyone who may have any connection to this story or who might be interested to discuss this further. Anyway, so thank you. I end.